Just to give a brief introduction to Ohio Stormwater Association, the webinar is being brought to you today through the Ohio Stormwater Association and some of its sponsors, as well as Ohio EPA. The Ohio Stormwater Association is dedicated to advancing the management of stormwater and related natural resources through education, leadership, watershed-based coordination, and technical assistance in Ohio. These are a list of our board of directors, and we're always looking for more involvement in the Ohio Stormwater Association. So if you know any of the members or want to know more about the association, please reach out to one of the board of directors or board members. We're also looking for participation in our 4 committees. We have an education committee, which is the committee that is putting on the webinar today. We have a marketing and membership committee, as well as a regulatory and transportation committee. It's easy to join the Ohio Stormwater Association. You can either go to ohiofwa.com or you can go to WAMO's website, WMAO.org, and select the stormwater option as your area of interest. There's also sponsorship opportunities available, and we would love to have your support. You can contact Harry Stark at that first email address, Kelly Kubander, or Bob Lentz at that third email address to become a sponsor. Now I'd like to introduce today's speakers. Our first speaker will be Justin Reinhart. He is an engineer with Ohio EPA's Division of Surface Water, where his role includes developing and maintaining Ohio's Stormwater Manual, the rainwater and land development, as well as providing technical assistance to Ohio EPA staff and local regulated community, as well as consultants and developers with navigating Ohio's NPDES construction general permit. He has 20 years of experience designing agricultural and urban conservation practices while at the Ohio Department of Natural Resources and Ohio Department of Agriculture before coming to Ohio EPA. He has a BS in civil engineering from the Ohio State University and is a registered professional engineer in Ohio. Our second speaker will be Dave Reuter. He is an urban conservation specialist at Franklin Soil and Water Conservation District, where he works with county, township, and municipal partners to manage and maintain the technical aspects of the NPDES stormwater permit requirements and issues within their community and with their residents. David is involved with the review of construction plans, ordinance reviews, and comprehensive plan and master plan development for the inclusion of sustainable development practices that will protect the existing ecosystem services our natural resources provide. David is a certified erosion, sediment, and stormwater inspector and is a member of the International Erosion Control Association, the Water Management Association of Ohio, and the Water Environment Federation. So now I'd like to take a moment to hand it over to Justin, our first speaker.
Okay, welcome everybody. We're going to start out today's webinar talking about pre-construction SWIP reviews. So I want to start out at the beginning, I guess, and just mention what is a SWIP, although I'm assuming it's old news to most of us in attendance. But just to reiterate, a good textbook definition I've got up on the screen here is site-specific document or collection documents. It does a number of things. Identify pollution sources or potential pollution sources, describes the control measures and BMPs that are going to be used to reduce or eliminate those, and identify the procedures the operator, contractor, landowners will be implementing to comply with their general permit. So that's a good textbook definition. But what I want to talk about today is a little bit more detail and think a little bit further about a SWIP. And it can be a lot more than just that. A SWIP is a couple of items here. A communication tool, maybe first and foremost. That can be a challenge because it's communicating many things to many folks, as we'll see. It's a thought process or an exercise. Okay, so there's a whole process that goes on through the development and eventually review of a SWIP. SWIP needs to be executable. It needs to be doable. needs to relay the proper information so that the expectations can be met, costs can be estimated and accrued for properly by the contractor or the people doing the sediment and erosion control work on the project. Everybody knows who's responsible when throughout the project to save problems from occurring down the road during construction. And, the last 2 points here are sort of intertwined in that it's a very different, unique type of document. It's very complex. It includes a lot of different media, narrative drawings, calculations, forms, etc. And not only is the SWIP its own document, but it's very much integrated with other documents, especially the contract plans, drawings, and specifications for the project, but possibly other documents as well that all become integrated and maybe even borrow from each other. So we have to keep that in mind. Where that gets challenging is most of the people preparing plans and the consulting engineering universe are really working towards the end product. And the developers as well are interested in the final product, the final building structure, whatever it may be that's going in. And all the emphasis is placed on that infrastructure, the materials that will be used, the sizes, dimensions, etc. Whereas construction is really a process. And a lot of what we're dealing with happens throughout that process. I took a statement here off of a plan that I thought was sort of interesting in that it says details have been provided in this plan as an effort to help the contractor provide erosion and sediment controls. And these two plans aren't from the same source, just using them as sort of background, but an effort to help. And it's like, well, no, it's really probably more than an effort to just help the contractor through the construction process. And that stems from the concept that engineers are really accustomed to, the coined means and methods, meaning the engineers aren't prescribing how to build something, just what to build. And when we talk about the how to build, that's when a lot of the issues come into play with sediment erosion controls, especially, and other pollutant discharges that might happen during the construction process. So really, a SWIP also is very specific and directive. It should really state exactly what is to be done, when, where, and how with regards to preventing those pollutant discharges. Now, that doesn't mean to say it's a finite document. It does change as construction things happen. There are certain unknowns, but as a very simplistic example, it doesn't. There's no necessarily liability there involved with a contractor can't be told when to take the trash out, so to speak. But the SWIP can identify that a dumpster is required on site and where it is to be located in an area that would not result in a discharge. So again, that's sort of a simplistic example, but demonstrates where there's a little bit of a direct direction that's required. But it also isn't really super specific in the sense that it assumes a lot of the liability for what happens on the job site. So keeping those things in mind, the next step in the SWIP is looking at the details of it, what goes into a SWIP. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. All of the details are fairly clearly spelled out in the construction general permit. There's 19 pages of description of what goes into a SWIP and how to do it in various levels of detail. It should be fairly clear as far as that goes. But what I want to mention there is the fact that this is where it ties into the thought process. A lot of these items are listed as almost a reminder or a question as to bringing up topics that may or may not come into play as we develop a SWIP and look at the potential discharges that occur. There are a lot of items in those 19 pages because this general permit is addressing all types of construction, various sizes and levels and degrees of projects. So it is very long and tedious. There's a lot of little descriptions in there, but these items aren't necessarily anything in and of themselves if they're not used properly. Identifying the soil on a construction site doesn't help if we don't understand, is that soil erodible or resistant to erosion? What does all that mean when we look those characteristics up? Does it require me to do something different, more or less, than I would on any other given site. So that's why I like to think of it as a thought process. Since we mentioned what's in a SWIP, let's do the counter to that and talk about maybe what's necessarily not in a SWIP. And I see a lot of SWIPs of various sizes, shapes, and forms, a lot of extraneous information, and those can make a review quite difficult at times. So it's hard to ferret out what is really the important information. One piece of good news, hopefully everybody has received by now, is the new permit that's a year and a half old, remove the requirement to put the copy of the actual permit in the SWIP. So there's 60 less pages for you. There are a lot of times local peak discharge requirements, flood control requirements that require a litany of hydrologic analysis in the form generally of hydrographs that end up being incorporated into SWIPs that can be upwards of hundreds of pages that are not necessarily part of the water quality element. They may provide insight into the design, but aren't necessarily part of an integral part of the SWIP. A lot of items may or may not, depending on the project. You have spill control plans, dust suppression plans, a 40144 authorizations, runoff reduction spreadsheet, the new runoff reduction method, may or may not be involved in a particular project. And then, of course, you've got items that really are always in a SWIP, and this isn't by any means an inclusive list, but various calculations, post-construction O&M. So you have a lot of other documents that all get incorporated into this one master document. I pulled a copy of the SWIP out here that was actually produced in a different state for a project here, but you'll see I really like how they incorporated a lot of those, what I would maybe say are extraneous, but relevant material into appendices within that SWIP. So all the pertinent material is up front and really constitutes the bulk of the SWIP, and the rest can be referred to as needed. So that's just kind of a thought to pass along. Okay, so now we've covered just sort of a general overview of a SWIP, at least from my perspective, and that's being the technical guy here in the room, not the administrative guy. Let's talk about the objectives, the technical objectives of the SWIP. First and foremost, state the obvious, right? Verify compliance with the general permit conditions, and also compliance with the MS4 permit, any other local regulations that you may have that come into play there. We're verifying that they're following the various conditions that are in the permit in order to be technically covered under that permit. But it's a little bit more than that. I think that the review of a SWIP provides a lot of opportunities. One is, if we address items on the front end, it saves us a lot of hassle on the back end when it comes to complaints being called in, enforcement actions that may need to be taken. If we can avoid a lot of that by doing that review and straightening things up front, that saves a lot of time and energy, probably in both the regulated community and ourselves as reviewers. It opens a line of communication, so we get to know who's doing what and responsible for what, hopefully start a positive relationship that allows us to communicate during that project and even into future projects. So there's a whole process improvement that can happen with contractors, consulting engineers, developers who are doing continuous work as we can work together to improve the concerns in our local community and the pollutant concerns that the SWIP is meant to address. So there's a lot of opportunity that can be had if we look at the reviews, I guess, in the right frame of mind. Okay, so switching gears, let's talk a little bit about just an approach to reviewing a SWIP. No flow charts here, no step-by-step process if that's what you're looking for, just big picture thinking to set the stage for you to develop a review process of your own. And that's going to be flexible based on a number of things, local requirements, types of projects that you're seeing, amount of projects you're seeing, staff, and et cetera. I think the first thing we need to get our heads around as a reviewer is that everything with a project needs to be done at a certain time, a certain sequence, under certain circumstances, schedules, et cetera. So we need to be thinking in terms of chronology here. Seasonally, too, things change. Obviously, weather, sediment, and erosion control concerns change along with the seasons. That means we need to look at that project in steps, where, as I mentioned earlier, most of our efforts go towards the final product, the end building, what's it going to look like. The SWIP is really designed at the construction process. So we need to know before the shovel even hits the ground, what does our site look like? What do we have there? That will help lead us into really what controls we're probably going to need. So in this case, I've got an existing site map, very essential to me being able to plan a SWIP with existing drainage areas, existing conditions as far as streams and land cover goes, assuming that most of this is going to probably be disturbed, graded, filled, cut, and altered in some way that's going to require SWIP controls. I can determine where my drainage areas are, and that's going to lead to a lot of the placement of various practices. So I should have a SWIP plan for that setting, that initial phase where a lot of my sediment discharge is probably going to be at its worst, the clearing and grubbing phase, the rough grading phases of construction, as you see here. That might take me to a second phase where now I've installed drainage infrastructure, catch basins, storm sewers. May, in this case, as shown here from the top to the bottom drawings, alter the drainage pattern. So whereas I had in a pre-construction and early construction phase water draining to the northwest on your screen, it's now being diverted to the southwest into a basin. So I can kind of get a feel for what's going to happen during the construction process, during these fairly readily identifiable phases of construction. I also need to be thinking about the plan, not start with the checklist. So we do have a checklist that really just cut and paste all the different criteria out of the permit to make your review easy. It's great for documenting the review and really a necessity for documenting that you've done the review, but it doesn't necessarily walk you through the project in the best manner. I like to begin with the actual plan itself. Going back to that existing site plan, you can mark it up. You can very easily start to guess where's water going, where are my discharges likely to be, and what are possible practices needed. I just outlined a couple of them here. These aren't to be anything specific, but just as a demonstration of, okay, I can start to identify where things might need to be, and that starts me asking questions. So then I can go look into the SWIP plan and start to see, okay, they do have basins right where I thought they would be. They do have perimeter controls right where I thought they would be. Maybe where I show the question mark, I thought there would be one and there's not. That forces me to ask more questions. Maybe it's not the right control. Maybe it is. On the north side of the drawing, I've got off-site discharge coming on through a silt fence. Is that concentrated flow? Is that going to be a problem? May or may not be, but at least it identifies the question that may need to be asked to the developer to get more information. We move to subsequent phases of the project. So now I've got infrastructure installed. I can start to look at those types of BMPs that go in. Inlets. I've got an inlet shown here in a backyard. Is this area going to be stabilized? Is it going to have inlet protection on it? Is it subject to a lot of sediment runoff from that area that may not be stabilized? To the northeast, there's a street end for a stub right next to a catch basin shown there. That's a popular place to do things like concrete washouts. Is that going to be too close to that inlet? Is that going to be a problem? Are the washouts shown somewhere else on the plan? Those are just questions to ask. It may or may not be answered in the plan. You may need to get more information. You may need to correct things. But those are the types of questions that you can start to ask when you're really looking at the plan and not simply checking off the boxes. And then finally, the last segment of a lot of construction or residential construction, individual lots. Do I have a control plan for the individual lot? Probably a typical. Has it addressed all the issues? The one I've shown here, I've checked through the boxes, but it doesn't list a concrete washout basin. Will there be concrete work? There's likely to be some at some point. Is it going to be a community basin? That goes kind of back to my previous question, makes it maybe more important that the location, if it's going to be communal at one of those street stubs, is not going to be a problem. It's going to be available for use throughout the project. So those are just good questions that kind of come about, or examples of questions that might come about during the review looking at the plans. I think the next topic is the BMPs themselves and identifying and understanding the design limitations that go with those. That really involves understanding how they work. To understand how they work will allow you to ask more critical questions of them, including how will it be built? Can it be built? You almost have to put your contractor hat on and understand how it's going to be installed. Does the plan give enough information for this to be installed correctly? We'll talk about that in a second. I can begin to look at my detailed drawings, and a lot of these are probably typical or standard drawings that are cut and paste and don't take a lot of time, but others might because they're going to be different with every project that occurs. Our basins, so post-construction and temporary sediment basins. Do I have skimmer information, sizing? Do I have an outlet, post-construction outlet control, typically an orifice, size with elevations provided? Then can I go through and check that that is correctly designed? That may be just verifying values, as I show on the table, that are right on the plans, and hopefully they provided that either a narrative or on the plans themselves. All the information that you need as far as data goes to the components. Spreadsheets can be very helpful with facilitating that review. I encourage you to create them or borrow them. This is just a quick chart I put together looking at, and I can't make it public yet because it's not been verified, but just to give you an example of what you can do, I've just a quick check of skimmer designs that what size orifice would be needed to provide that 48-hour drawdown based on different drainage areas. And I can quickly glance at this and go back one slide and look at my skimmer dewatering hole in the far right at 4.7 inches and my drainage area, tributary area, and my height of that dewatering zone, and quickly double check and say, oh, okay, 4.7 inches seems to work fine, or it's close enough for us for now. That can really facilitate a review. Spreadsheet on the water quality volume. This is one for the redevelopment, famous equation 3 now in the permit, to be able to go through and check that and verify that the values are calculated properly. Can save you a lot of time. Sometimes you need data to do that type of analysis. So if I look at our available to you on the website compliance checking tool, if I were to look at verifying the drawdown requirements for a wet extended detention basin, I probably have an orifice size, I probably have elevations, but do I have enough information in the form of stage area, stage storage, to identify the volumes in that pond to create a drawdown? So I might need to, if possible, scale that off drawings, ask for that to be provided, pull it out of calculations provided through software. Understanding the design helps me assess if a project will work. If we have the fallback rainwater and land development standards to go to, which are our state standards for how the design variables should be within all of the various practices as we see them best implemented. Sometimes there's flexibility there that might occur. This is, we'll pick on bioretention. It's the easiest to do, but you look at a project here and I can start asking questions. I can look at the, as I highlighted here, the 1.5 foot of engineered soil planting mixture and see that that's probably a little bit less than we typically would see in a rainwater standard of 2 feet. So why is that? And what does that mean? Does that reduce my treatment level, or is that going to be connected to the plant material? If I've got deep-rooted plant material, that might become a problem. So I need to ask questions about the plant material to see if 1.5 feet is really workable or not. It may or may not be. I look at my under drain. I've got a filter fabric requirement. We see a lot of that. Our advice is generally to not use that because it can clog, but maybe there's a reason why the engineer felt that was needed. Is it being placed in the right place? Where is it being placed when it says under drain in filter fabric? Is that enough detail? It also shows a 2 foot thick clay layer required compacted to 85% dry modified Proctor test. So we're effectively lining this basin. Generally, our stormwater controls, from at least my perspective, are encouraging infiltration. Why are we lining this? Is there a contaminated soil issue? Is there some sort of shortcutting issue we're concerned about? I'm not saying it's wrong to do this. I'm saying it just raises the question that there may be more I need to know about the particular project to understand it when I see these red, orange, and yellow flags. So those are just examples of ways to critically think through a project, not necessarily this particular one or the BMP itself. A lot of the details are where, as they say, the devil lies. That is where things go wrong. Case in point, very recent discussions had with local MS4 about a bioretention cell. If you can't tell, that's a bioretention cell. It's wet. It laid wet. They couldn't figure out why. Spent a lot of time and effort trying to understand where it failed or was failing, and ultimately came to the conclusion that it was because, as you see here, the contractor installed 8 feet of perforated pipe. They really needed 50 or 60. That was a failure in communication. Not saying the contractor did anything wrong. The engineer did anything wrong, but we clearly had a miscommunication in the fact that we should have had a couple $100 more of pipe in there to solve this problem that probably will cost a lot more to fix. So that's where the details come in, and we really need to assess from a, can this be built? And do I have the information to build it type of question. So ask lots of good questions during the review. Have a list of them. Those questions can be something like, who's responsible for implementing the controls? If you look at the EPA version of their SWIP template, it goes through and has that nice little formula or format that a lot of people use that has practice by practice. When is it going to be built? Who's responsible for it? Identify all that information. Those are good questions you could ask. You might say, are there contingencies for various times a year? Here's a SWIP that says final grading. Okay, we're going to do our final grading and permanent seeding in December of 2020. Okay, what if the weather is not very conducive to permanent seeding in December this year? May or may not be. It may be snow covered. It may be frozen. Well, we're going to do repair work in August. Okay, that's going to be 9 months from now, September. Those are questions of timing. And I understand construction is variable, and it may not be as specific as work will start on August 1st of 2020. But those are obvious questions that we can ask that can be addressed in the SWIP. When will post-construction controls be operational within a project? This is your list, so that's all I've got for you, but you'll have to add to it as you gain experience and review projects and come across issues that you can start to develop to ask really good questions during the review process. I'll make a brief mention regarding the technical aspects. If you would like to keep updated with various changes that are happening as we try and implement them through the Rainwater Land Development Manual, including things that were done based on the not-so-new permit now, I would encourage you to join the listserv I've created, and that's simply just a distribution list, not a forum. There's some quick steps to do that. You can get to it through our Customer Support Center. At the EPA webpage, you'll have to enter a username and password to create that to allow you and only you to access, meaning subscribe or unsubscribe to that mailing list. Haven't used it yet, but will be shortly, sending out various reminders and updates as they become available. And those will be coming straight from me. So just a few take-home points. Again, I think a review is time well spent. You can save a lot of time, energy, and money on the back end. Think of a crossword puzzle, not a word hunt. We're not trying to find things and check boxes, but think deeply and critically about the project during the process. And lastly, it is a process, not a final product. So be thinking throughout that process from beginning to end and through post-construction, what problems might we have and how can we best address them. And there's my information for you. If you need any help, please feel free to give me a call, email anytime. And I'll turn it over to Dave.
So good morning, everybody. I'm Dave Reuter, urban conservationist with Franklin Soil and Water. When I was asked to do this, I thought, yeah, I can get through construction site inspections pretty quick. But when I starting to put this together, it kind of took me down a lot of rabbit holes, and I started looking at this thinking, well, what can I really offer here that's going to be helpful to you? So really, what I'm kind of looking at, the only way I can do this is tell you stories on things that we've had problems with, issues, different approaches we've taken to things, and looking at that process. But overall, so I hope you find something useful, at least from a process aspect or issues that you might encounter. And really what it comes down is a lot of planning. You saw some of that in Justin's presentation, is looking at that planning aspect of it. And hopefully I can give you some ideas here on things with your program. So I've been an urban conservationist about 14 years with the district. Before that, it was working with state DOTs on their phase 1 compliance. So I can literally say I've been doing this since the last century. It's kind of dating me, but that's actually a fact. So here's just something about the district. I did want to talk a little bit about the district. Just to preface this with saying that every program is a little bit different. Your location, the permitting environment you're working in, kind of creates how your programs work for MS4s in your locality. So with that, when we look at this map here, I know you probably can't read any of the legend or anything, but the important thing to look at there is the purple areas are the census blocks from the 2010 census that indicate urban areas within Ohio. The blue areas are the counties that contain urban areas within those boundaries. So all of these areas, everything you see that's not colored there, or the colored parts, have something to do with the MPDS permits. They have requirements there. Those MS4s are required to meet all the minimum control measures. And there's just a lot of opportunity out there. We had a switch in where the soil and water districts were housed. They've gone to the Department of Agriculture. And when I started, there were only a few urban conservationists out there. And our point to this was, that we have largely a urban state. We have about 10 million people in those blue counties. 6 million of those are in those urbanized areas. So there are, what you see then, the bar graph to the left kind of illustrates that. The small blocks over there, that's about 660,000 people that live in those states that don't have urbanized areas. So the vast majority of population in Ohio is basically affected by the MS4, the MPDS permits. In the center there, if you're not familiar with Ohio, for those out of state, or if you are, there's Columbus. We're the central Ohio area. There are 4 phase 1 communities in Ohio. Those occur basically at Cincinnati, Dayton, Columbus, and Toledo. Surprisingly, Cleveland is not a phase 1 community. That's all phase 2 up there. So it has different effects on your programs and what you do within your communities for MS4 compliance. Here's a spreadsheet. I got to keep track of who we have agreements with. We have grant agreements with most of the communities in Franklin County. Those vary on what services we provide. You can see most of those MCM 1 and 2, the pipe programs are the most popular with everybody. Columbus is the 15th largest city in the United States. I don't think a lot of people realize that. And the metropolitan area, we probably have about 1.5 million people. So education and outreach is a big area of what we do in the district. We also have within the county 17 townships that we work with in unincorporated Franklin County. 7 of those have their own zoning. And we usually have our enforcement capabilities through zoning compliance. So it's very important that we have those rules in place. The townships have their rules in place as well, so they can support any enforcement that we need to be doing relative to NPDES. So here's another aspect. This is Franklin County and the watersheds that I deal with. There's 5 watersheds here. All of them have TMDLs on them, except for the Scioto, which has a draft TMDL. And I also have what used to be 3 permits, construction general permits to deal with. Now it's 2 appendices to the construction general, but we have the Big Darby, which was a special permit, and the Olentangy permit, which is a special permit. So I guess that's one privilege of being the location of the central office of EPA. So I've got a lot of different aspects. This comes up, in plan reviews. I've got communities that span different permits, span different TMDL requirements. It just is almost an administrative practice more so than an implementation, because there's a lot of moving parts to this. So that's kind of a bit about the district. Let's get into a little bit of how we actually do site inspections. And I threw pre-construction in here because it really is a part of that site inspection aspect. And I'm thinking more of the aspect from zoning and comprehensive plans and the overall sustainability of practices. If you're only doing site inspections within your community, you're missing the boat on a lot of conservation. This kind of goes back to our mission statement, where we're looking at preservation and conservation of those resources. Getting in with your zoning groups, sitting on comprehensive plan boards, and providing that sustainable voice in this has really gone a long ways in a lot of our communities here, where you not only it helps that political will, it gives you some political capital to have some of that in place. When you have a community that says we want to have green infrastructure in our community, then when you get plans, if you're getting construction site plans, it's too late to say, gee, it would have been nice to have a stream setback on this, or preserve that woods or something of that nature. So that pre-construction aspect and having that voice is really an important part in site construction. Oops. I just want to give an example here. We deal with a lot with urban stream erosion, and having setbacks, that's an important thing. I talk with a lot of communities, and they say, yeah, we have setbacks, we protect that, but they're generally, standard width. They don't take into account, steep slopes or wooded corridors, things of that nature. So it's very important that you build that in up front to have that kind of information there for them to use. Here's just kind of a example I like to show. You look at a typical lot, forested lot along a stream, and somebody wants to build their home there. They're thinking, I want to look over the stream, see the water, and you typically get that basically no conservation, 10% forest cover left kind of development. If you have stream setbacks, standard width stream setback gets applied to that. You're protecting 25 feet, 50 feet, something like that. Doesn't account for the trees, doesn't account for slopes or anything like that. So you're ending up with that 25% forest cover left. And then if you're looking at like a tree ordinance as well on top of that setback requirement, now you're looking at more of that 40% coverage. So that's just a way of building in site controls, that ultimately become BMPs for sites. Let's talk a little bit about plan reviews. So technical review committees, we have these here in Franklin County. I sit on several communities, technical review boards, and the counties as well. They're really a great thing. They bring the applicant together along with the technical agencies that are making comments on those, and you can really sit down and talk about things. And this is where you can also get those upfront items and not just see the construction plans. So this is giving you, consistent plan submittals, both in the review and the comments. And what I've heard from developers is, it gives you a reliable process and a time frame that they can rely on. They're not being called back for comments made, 3 and 4 times in the process. You're not hearing new comments from a new reviewer. It gets done all at once. Everybody sits and understands what the process is and how long it's going to take, and you get that more reliable process in place. Checklists, you saw some of those with Justin's presentation. I think they're great. Having that checklist for items that you look at, that's just a quick snapshot of the ones that we use for either plan reviews or SWIP reviews. A short one-pager, a lot of those things are more in-depth if you get into them, like checking the calculations. But, once you look at that and have those check boxes marked, you've got a consistency there amongst plan reviewers. And you also get those comments kind of all in place and ready to go. Pre-construction meetings, I can't say enough about how useful those are. If you don't have those, I would recommend those for your site inspections and enforcement. It gets everybody again in that same meeting room. You can go through who the faces are. And we do our site inspections twice a month or bi-weekly, however you want to look at that. We've found that being on site more than monthly, which is what the MS4 requirement is, permit requirement, that more regular site inspection gives you a face to meet. You start knowing the people on site, and you get really better compliance from that. Those pre-con meetings, that's where you get those expectations. We have a lot of communities that, their big thing is keeping the roads clean. And it always comes out that, hey, the mayor drives this road every day. Be sure you have a street sweeping program in place. Those kind of things come up at those meetings, and it kind of puts the contractors on notice that's the expectation that's going to be there. Enforcement protocols, we go over those at pre-con meetings. I think it's always good to know, especially when it comes to the sediment and erosion control, what your enforcement protocol is. We will generally hand that to them and let them know that this is how things will go for enforcement. And I think that's been pretty well received for the most part. So let's talk a little bit during active construction. Some of the issues that we've seen during active construction or at that state of where you're going to begin construction. State building codes is one item. Frequently, governmental buildings, schools, or religious buildings need to go through the state building requirements first, and they get approved basically at that point and begin construction. A lot of times jumping over the local MS4 requirements or perhaps floodplain coordination. We have a few townships, especially in the Darby area, that have land disturbance permits for capturing development under the 1 acre requirement. So a lot of times we've seen these construction projects start and they're calling us saying, hey, do you know about this project? And we're kind of like, no, we haven't heard that. OEPA permits, same kind of thing. The Darby permit requires that the SWIP be submitted to them 45 days in advance. And a lot of times the contractors think that's their permit approval to start. And they begin construction only to find that there, again, is something with the local MS4 that needs to be covered. ODA, Division of Ag, we do get calls about pole barns a lot. You know, hey, there's this big construction project going on. And a lot of those are covered practices with agriculture that we don't have the authority over. So sometimes we got to look at that. I put in there coordination. Something that had come up recently in a township was geothermal. It's something I learned just last year. Geothermal installations actually have a general permit. And we had an instance of a residential geothermal that went in that discharged to the surface and was flooding the county roadside ditch and causing problems with neighbors as well, at least for drainage purposes. So they actually put a moratorium on residential geothermal in their township because of that incident. But that was something on geothermals that I had not realized that there was a general permit for, and we needed to coordinate that, as well as look out for things like some of the requirements in that permit were whether or not it discharges to state waters or waters like the Darby, which were not allowed. So that kind of falls on us to look at geothermal and understand where those are discharging. Individual permits for HSTS is another matter that came up for us. We have some HSTS that are tied to our MS4, yet they have individual discharge permits with OEPA, and it'll be interesting to see in the long term, because we have MS4 requirements to control those discharges should that fail. You know, it will become part of enforcement by EPA instead of the MS4 at that point. So again, site inspections, understanding the MS4 and CGP requirements. We've had communities that look at the CGP permit. The requirements there are looking at your site after rain events, or at least weekly. The MS4 requirement is a monthly requirement, kind of a third-party inspection of the sites. But we've had communities that were actually doing those CGP permit inspections for the contractors. And I basically asked them, well, do you realize that you're actually kind of subsidizing contractor inspections? They should be doing this for their own. You should be the one coming in and checking to make sure that they're doing the correct inspections. And then also SWIPs, they're static. Construction is not static. We always recommend that they have an on-site SWIP, preferably one that is marked up as practices come and go. That way, when changes do occur, it's something that's happened at least on site. And that site documentation is your insurance. So when EPA shows up or when we show up and that dandy bag is not there, you can explain why that is and show that on your SWIP. And that helps contractors with being, like I say, it's their insurance that they're following their SWIP, but they are making changes and noting those changes as well. And that enforcement and escalation, that's something. So we've had a few sites with EPA they will tend to issue an NOV for things that we would consider maintenance issue. It's the same time frame. They give you 2 weeks to take care of things. We give you, 10 working days to take care of a maintenance issue. Part of our escalation process is, if it's a maintenance and it's not repaired in our next visit, then that's a second strike against you. And we reschedule a return visit in 3 days. And within 14 days, you're either complying or getting a stop work order. So whether or not it almost comes down to semantics, and it comes down to cooperating and working. We're both working for the same thing, water quality. But that's really the same issues with enforcement. So, and silos, we deal with a lot of silos, even within our permit partners. I have economic development and planning that handles the zoning, and the county drainage engineer. They work with a lot of the sites in taking over control of those, particularly under the petition ditch process. And then we do a lot of the inspections and enforcement. So looking at those silos and bridging that can be problematic. Local zoning, again, those silos, breaking those down between local township zoning. We have this within our permit as well. The difference between the MS4 control and the local townships. And then, of course, contractors, too. When you're on a site, they may have a site contractor for sediment erosion control, and they have to go through various levels to get to that control. Post-construction, I will quickly talk to on post-construction. Looking at that long-term O&M and bonding and agreements in post-construction, that's something that's required by the MS4 permit. But know how you get to those and know what kind of agreements there are. Know when that bonding is released. We have, the district does not control the bonding, the engineers do, and we have different punch-out lists that might need to be met before that post-construction is ready. And post-construction, think about it, we look at that as part of construction. It's not post-construction until it's handed over to the owner. So there should be that aspect of looking at that. I had a pleasure of visiting Cuyahoga County a few weeks back and talked to them about their urban program. They hold transition meetings, which I thought was a great idea. Is, again, just like a pre-con, you're having really a post-con that hands over a BMP to the owner so that they understand what that entails, what that long-term management is, and then have programmatic outreach that's going to talk to this in the long term, whether that's brochures you can mail out, mailings that go out annually, or something like that within your MS4 that's going to help get that information out and keep these systems running in the long term. I think that's about it for me. Here's my information. Should you have any questions, feel free to email me. And a lot of our materials are freely available for your use. If you're trying to do programs and need some help with that, feel free to contact me, and I can see what I can get to you. That's all I have. I'll say thanks and turn it back over.
Thank you, Justin and David. Those are some really good presentations. I just want to take a minute to thank our Ohio Stormwater Association organizational partners. Listed here are the silver level sponsors, our gold level sponsors, and our platinum level sponsors. So thank you to all of our Ohio Stormwater Association organizational partners. This webinar and other Ohio Stormwater education and other events would not be possible without our partners and sponsors. Also, just want to take a minute to mark your calendars for a few upcoming Ohio Stormwater Association events. October 22nd, in partnership with OWEA, we are doing a watershed workshop at The Ohio State University. It's an all-day technical session focused on watershed topics. The agenda looks pretty good. So you can sign up to register at ohiowea.org. We also have 2 more webinars scheduled for this year. The topics to be determined. One will be October 24th from 11 to noon, and the other one will be November 22nd from 11 to noon. I also want to take a quick minute to note that they are calling for abstracts for the Ohio Stormwater Conference, which will be May 6th through 8th next year at Kalahari. So if you have a good topic you'd like to present, please submit an abstract for the Ohio Stormwater Conference. And also, there's some information, too, if you would like to get involved in the Ohio Stormwater Association. Well, thank you again for everyone that decided to stay and, that everybody that attended the webinar today. Sorry it went over just a little bit. In conclusion, we really appreciate your time today. We had some really good questions. The presenters presented some really good topics today. But if you do have any other specific questions, feel free to reach out to either the speakers or me. There were a couple questions about the webinar recording and getting the presentation slides. We are recording this webinar, and we will be posting the recording along with the PowerPoint presentation. It usually takes us approximately 1.5 to 2 weeks to have the webinar edited and posted on the website. And again, you will receive an email notifying you that the recording and presentation have been posted. This email will also include the contact information of today's presenters if you guys have any further questions. So thanks again.